And overall, I mean, one of the big issues still is that the bulwarks to defend democratic institutions against criminal intrusions really haven't been implemented. I mean, we've seen this dramatically in this electoral cycle.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. Claudia Sheinbaum will be the next president of Mexico. In national elections on June 2nd, the protégé of President López Obrador and former mayor of Mexico City won a landslide victory, earning nearly 59% of the vote. She is a climate scientist and will be the first woman and first person of Jewish origin to lead the overwhelmingly Catholic country. But beyond the presidency, there were over 20,000 positions at all levels of government up for election, and it was in these state and local contests that things turned violent, very violent. This was by far the bloodiest election in Mexico's history, with over 30 candidates assassinated in the course of campaigning. My guest today, Falko Ernst, is the senior analyst for Mexico at the International Crisis Group. As he explains, this election-related violence is a product of criminal gangs competing for control, influence, power, and wealth. We kick off discussing Claudia Sheinbaum's background and her unique approach to violent crime as mayor of Mexico City. We then discuss the dynamics that led to violence in the lead-up to these elections and what can be done to disrupt the sway of criminal gangs over local politics in Mexico. As always, thank you for listening. This is obviously a timely conversation. And of course, as always, if you have recommendations of people I should interview or topics I should cover, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. Now here is my conversation with Falko Ernst of the International Crisis Group. Can you give us a biographical sketch of Claudia Sheinbaum, who seems to be like an interesting political figure, a climate scientist who also ran Mexico City, which is one of the world's largest cities. So who is she?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, to a degree, we're going to see who she is as Mexico's leading politician over the next 6 years. And there's a number of question marks behind that. But I mean, she does have an interesting background. I mean, she's a trained physicist. She has roots in social movements in Mexico, in the on-the-ground left, to put it this way. And she transitioned into politics. She's been close to López Obrador, the outgoing president, for quite a while and became his political daughter in many ways. And then, of course, her most prominent gig so far has been the mayorship in Mexico City. Here, I think we receive some indications of where she might be headed as president as well, especially as concerns security, because one of the main items that she ran on during this presidential campaign was her stated success in lowering homicide rates and other serious crimes in Mexico City by working hand in hand with the security team that took over the Secretariat for Public Security in the city. And from all we can tell, even though there's, again, a number of doubts as to the veracity of official statistics and so on and so forth, but who did a better job at streamlining the actions of police in Mexico City and really managed to more directly and deliberately address what they call generators of violence, i.e. really mapping out criminal networks, finding out through better on the ground, on the streets, intelligence work done by police, who integrates criminal networks, who does what, who murders people, and then have police target them specifically to provoke an effect of lowering homicide rates and situational crime prevention, essentially.
And it's fair to say that Mexico City, compared to other areas in Mexico, really did do a much better job on the security front and is less impacted by murder and gang violence, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mexico City is quite exceptional in the sense that, to begin with, you have a better trained police force than you might expect somewhere else in Mexico. But what's also interesting about this project that they implemented in Mexico City is that it's come with a greater degree of transparency. They have been more willing to engage with outsiders and have actually invited academics on board to provide a degree of monitoring and evaluation, which is something almost unheard of when you look at the transparency of other security bodies in Mexico. And that being said, you had a better tool in a form of the police to start working with. And that's going to be one of the big challenges. I'm also looking at the rest of the country, because what we've heard so far from her security team and from herself as well, that they want to extrapolate this experience in the city to other parts of the country, including high conflict areas. And there you're facing a number of other challenges that might come in as factors diluting those efforts. I mean, the hope is that won't take place, but the challenges are greater already because you don't have such a well-equipped security body in place in many areas. Corruption and collusion is more drastic, is more frank in many other areas in Mexico. And you're also confronting a different type of organized crime problem than you do in the city, because here organized crime, of course, exists. It operates in many, many ways. It is also violent, but it is not as paramilitary in nature as criminal groups are in high conflict areas.
So would you say that it is her approach to security that propelled her to such an overwhelmingly lopsided victory in the elections? Or are there other things going on in the domestic political space that are perhaps equally or more telling of why it is that she won so overwhelmingly in this election?
In terms of her proposals of how to turn around security or insecurity in Mexico, she's remained kind of coy during this campaign. So, she really hasn't given away that much. And from her team's perspective, that can count as sound electoral strategy, precisely because she was riding on a huge wave of popularity of López Obrador and of Morena.
And Morena is the party of her and López Obrador.
The governing party, exactly. It's sort of like the project of López Obrador. He created the party and it really became his personal vehicle for power, which he managed to achieve after various attempts with other parties to run for the highest office. And Morena finally did the trick. Claudia is using that wave and has used that wave to come into power and not sticking her neck out too much by being too precise about any type of policy proposal, really. Was it a logical thing to do right now? And I think looking at what accounts for this really overwhelming victory that we have seen yesterday, what also really factors in prominently is the lack of a credible opposition right now in Mexico. So Xochitl Gálvez, the opposition candidate, she ran on a three-party platform of PAN, PRI, PRD. All of those are old parties that in popular experience and popular imagination are intimately tied to bad security policies in the past and also to corruption scandals. Mm-hmm. The opposition really hasn't managed to reinvent itself, to give itself a new credible form. And I think that in large part also accounts for Morena's place right now as an inevitable option when it comes to political power.
So these elections were for far more than president. There were thousands of seats open for election throughout the country. And these were just extraordinarily violent elections. Over 30 candidates were killed in the run-up to Sunday's elections. Is there a general profile why or who the candidates that were assassinated, what accounted for their assassination? Why were they targeted in particular? Are there some generalities you can extrapolate based on the fact that so many candidates have been killed on the run-up to these elections?
There's a high variety of the logics of political killings in Mexico these days. Mexico doesn't have one monolithic conflict that follows the same pattern, but we have a high divergence on a regional level. Different state crime overlaps come into play, different desires by different power actors, different criminalized or criminal economies that are being fought over. So it's a bit hard to really state that, all candidates are being killed for a particular reason. Also, we are really left to guess many times because the impunity rate for these kind of crimes is almost perfect. So there's a reflection here of the general impunity rate for murder in Mexico, which is still above 95%. And so we don't really know on, a legally safe basis of what happens in each case.
So these cases just aren't getting solved.
They are not getting solved. That's correct. Yes. So, one of the big problems we faced in Mexico and we are still facing, we will continue to face, is that the state attorney's offices, police have been either unwilling or unable to build cases, to investigate cases, and to bring those to justice. And that essentially has given great leeway for actors interested in using violence in order to gain political power, to employ that as a tool. And overall, one of the big issues still is that the bulwarks to defend democratic institutions against criminal intrusions really haven't been implemented. We've seen this dramatically in this electoral cycle as well. And that provides a wide entry gate for criminal interests to push into the state. And at the same time, for criminal groups, and we've had a number of conversations with criminal leaders, with members of the criminal world, to put it this way, but also political operators and military and so on and so forth on that matter, is that really boils down to gaining state access being the number one resource you need as a criminal group to further your interests and to stay afloat.
So how does that work? Can you unpack that? So say you're a criminal organization and you just need an ally in political office. Like, why is that? And how does that advance your criminal interests? It seems intuitive, but I'd be interested in just having you describe some examples.
The question really hasn't become so much whether criminal groups gain access to the state and get to influence the decisions of office holders, but which ones. So essentially, they are doomed to play the game, because if you don't succeed in successfully playing this game, then your competition will gain access. And gaining access here very concretely means that you get to enjoy a number of benefits. The most basic one is impunity, in the sense that impunity is going to be dished out in one or the other direction, in a way. And you need to make sure that it is dished out in ways that favor your group and not the other. And at the same time, gaining state access and sway over administrations also means that you get to influence how security bodies act on the ground, how they participate in conflicts, and whom they target. So that is, of course, crucial for your own survival as a group as well. And beyond that, you get intelligence, state internal intelligence about operations. You get to enjoy financial benefits, including the ability to place your own personnel or people tied to you on public payrolls, an old political game in Mexico, which is now being played by criminal groups as well. And you get access to public contracts where a lot of money flows. So all of those have really become main assets for these groups.
And this dynamic that you describe is mostly playing out at the local, municipal, or state level.
To a degree, it plays out on all levels, but it's most overt on the municipal level, because here we're talking about institutions that have really been left vulnerable vis-a-vis bare criminal power. And we've seen a trend over the past 20 years, really, where the power relationship between state and crime has become tilted to the degree that criminal groups, local paramilitary leaders, put them this way, narco-paramilitaries, directly call the shots over these institutions. And municipal presidents and police really can compete with the firepower of these increasingly paramilitarized criminal groups. So there it's most drastic, but these kind of deals are also being brokered at the governance level, for instance. Criminal groups have a lot of bargaining chips to influence different political races, electoral races. One is, of course, campaign financing. Another one is that they have built massive social control over civilian populations, and local civilians are many times told who they need to vote for. So these groups get to trade in blocks of votes when they negotiate with prospective office holders.
Could you give an example of a candidate who was assassinated this cycle that you think is just particularly illustrative of some of the trends that you've been describing?
One in particular, I think, was a double homicide or two homicides on the same day in a town called Marabatío in the state of Michoacán, which has seen very, very high levels of conflict over the past 15 years already. It was ground zero for the war on drugs back in 2006. And one day, a few months back, two candidates from different parties were shot and killed the same day. So that speaks of a very just overt claim of power over the local political process, where you have criminal leaders that essentially say, you don't play along with me, or you make a pact with my competitor, and the consequence will be drastic. This is actually something we talked through with one particular criminal leader from Michoacán who was describing his reasons and his logic and his methodology of how to intervene into the electoral process. There was complexity involved here as well. But at the end of the day, it really boiled down to him saying, okay, if I learn that a candidate is in cahoots with one of my competitors, I will take him out of the race. Full stop.
What can be done to disrupt some of these dynamics at the local level? I mean, you described Claudia Sheinbaum's strategy as mayor of Mexico's largest city, and frankly, one of the largest cities in the hemisphere. Is that replicable in some of these smaller towns, municipalities, and other precincts throughout the country?
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge challenge. It's a really, really tough nut to crack because, in this electoral cycle, you have had groups gaining access to state institutions and gaining sway over how state institutions act. So this element that distorts state action, that undercuts policies and implementation, is in the system already. And that has happened on a structural basis, on a very wide basis. So you, as top decision maker in a country, are essentially left with a very wide and deep problem. And you're going to have to choose your battles wisely and ask yourself where you want to start out to try and fix the problem. Because right now, just fixing it across the board, wiping it away, promising a quick and easy fix is out of the realm of reality. And what we've heard from her security team and conversations with them, but also what they've released publicly to a degree, is that they will be trying to do just that, in the sense that they want to focus their resources and efforts on the most violent areas in Mexico. So her prospective security secretary, a man called Harfuch, he is talking about concentrating those efforts in the 10 most violent states, in the 10 states that, see most homicides on a national scale. And here, the advantage, to put it this way, that a positive sign is that you still have very high geographical concentration of lethal violence in Mexico, and that gives you a prospective starting point to try and turn things around. But essentially, and this is something we've recommended from over years, really, in our writings at Crisis Group as well, is that you need to concentrate resources within existing state institutions, because a reform process across the board has failed in the past because it was too ambitious and it didn't manage to make a dent in, among other things, corruption and collusion, deeply ingrained cultures thereof within institutions. So the best bet would be to carve out enclaves as more functional tools to get the job done on the ground. And at the same time, really try to map out who the most pernicious criminal networks and drivers of that kind of violence that affects communities directly are, and try to target them as a priority matter. Because overall, you also have more than 200 illegal armed groups out on Mexican streets nowadays, operating at least 200, according to our own estimations. And that limits what you can do short term. So interestingly, the conversation on the ground in Mexico has really drifted away from the notion that you can get drugs out of the picture, that you can successfully wage a war on drugs, and rather drifted to thinking about how to better protect communities. Because one of the things we've seen is that organized crime in Mexico and the production of violence is not just tied to drugs anymore and international drugs trafficking, but it is intimately tied to extortion rackets, which have become a boom market for these groups and a huge source of financing, in the sense that, they have used impunity and the leeway provided to them by an absence of a good security strategy during this administration, but also the past one, to push into originally illicit economies and extract rents from those vulnerable commodity chains, essentially. And that
Interesting.
takes money directly out of the pockets of local economies and local citizens. And there we've seen an explosion of predatory behavior by criminal groups against their own communities. And that is seen by many in Mexico as the most pressing issue to resolve.
That's interesting to me because I'm wondering if that then presents some sort of point of conflict between the government of Mexico and the government of the United States. Presumably, the United States is focused on, drugs, 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 whereas as you describe it, the kind of thinking in Mexico security circles has broadened beyond just looking vertically at drugs to more systematically looking at how do you protect communities from gangs that may or may not be involved in the drugs trade. So do you foresee that being like a point of conflict going forward between Sheinbaum and whoever is the next US president?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's going to be one of the main things to watch, I think, especially as we will know in November also who's going to occupy the White House. And under a certain scenario, those demands for a hawkish approach to Mexico to stop fentanyl, to stop crystal methamphetamine to a lesser degree, and to be hard on migration. Those are demands that are very, very prominent in the US. And I mean, not entirely surprising if you look at the overdose deaths and social harm that's being done through fentanyl, especially synthetic opioids in US communities. But those demands really clash into a more pragmatic, a dawning pragmatic approach in Mexico on the ground, and the recognition that you cannot just bomb away the problem, which has been tried for 50 years, essentially under the motto of the war on drugs and hasn't worked. It's actually backfired in many, many ways to make violence worse on the ground in Mexico and really threaten security and stability on an unprecedented level. And this is what we're seeing, when we talk about more than 30,000 homicides and a humanitarian crisis in form of displacements, in form of disappearances, and that is very much ongoing in Mexico nowadays. So both sides, and for the Mexican administration, is going to be absolutely crucial to try to find common ground with the United States. And I think here there is, surprisingly, if we define a common ground here a bit more creatively, there is a platform to work together because, we've had conversations also with the more hawkish voices in the United States, engaging with them to try to figure out what they actually want, and doing the same with actors, stakeholders on the ground, all levels in Mexico. And essentially both sides are thinking about how to better message toward the criminal population, because the US, behind closed doors, the more hawkish voices, they're also granting that you cannot just get rid of the problem by sending in special forces and sending US troops onto Mexican soil, even though that might fly on a more populist level. But really are thinking about how to curb the most harmful criminal groups. Here, social harm being defined, of course, as direct harm on their communities. And the Mexican side is also thinking about how to establish a hierarchy of the most pernicious criminal groups on the ground doing social harm to their communities. And here we might see some kind of overlap. But if the public posturing continues, then I think it's going to be hard to sustain this, really stick their heads together and find this type of synergy on the working level. So there's going to be a lot of tension along those lines, beyond any doubt.
So lastly, as Sheinbaum takes office, are there any key decisions that you'll be looking towards that she will have to make, or key moments or inflection points that will suggest to you how indeed she will pursue some of these key questions around security and taking on organized crime and reducing homicide rates?
First one is, how much of a methodology we'll see on the ground in the most lethal areas of Mexico. So in practice, how sound the methodology is going to be, how sound the implementation process is going to be, and how they're going to pull off the stunt of drawing together the needed institutional resources to get things done. The second one is the US relation, of how they manage that. And then I think the third big one is also going to be the new administration's treatment of democratic checks and balances. So there has been quite a vocal call by López Obrador, by Morena, and we still don't really know how Sheinbaum is going to position herself towards those matters, even though she's indicated a rough path by saying she's going to stay true to, the outgoing administration's goals and overall objectives on the ground. But López Obrador has been very clear about the fact that he would like to see independent oversight bodies such as the National Electoral Institute that manages and watches elections and secures, relatively free elections currently, and Transparency Institute that processes freedom of information requests. He said that he would like to see those go because he has been portraying those as tools for a reactionary opposition for foes in media, opposition, and civil society. So by international neoliberal, as he has said, opponents of his fourth transformation political project. And the same has also applied toward the armed forces, where we've seen a number of initiatives to really empower the armed forces as one of the main pillars of the Mexican state under the Morena party within public security, but also beyond public security. That brings, as does the possible curbing of these independent checks and balance mechanisms, a number of legal issues, because essentially to push through these reforms and these ideas, you have to have a supermajority in the legislature in order to change the constitution and really cement those processes that some are saying push us deeper onto an authoritarian path in Mexico. And here we have a quite interesting but also worrying constellation coming up in September, because López Obrador is leaving his office at the end of the month. But on the 1st of the month, we'll have a new Congress inaugurated. And that Congress, it looks right now, looking at the electoral results yesterday, might well have a supermajority for Morena and its allied parties. So López Obrador might be given a full month to push through his greatest ambitions.
That'll be interesting to see. Obrador unleashed or unrestrained. Obrador unrestrained. Exactly. Not like he's been terribly restrained prior. Well, Falko, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.